Chapter 14.5 Conflict and Development The Scope of Violent Conflict and Conflict Risk. Physical Security. Physical security is the foundation for human capability. It is also the assurance of security may be the most fundamental of all institutions for development. It is also important since violent conflict has held back progress in many of the poorest countries. It is also essential in business continuity to migrate and manage and rising physical threats that increase corporate risk and potentially could impact business continuity. Lastly, it is the key to a peaceful society since its people will live without worrying and harm surrounding them. In addition to the horrors of the conflicts and their aftermaths themselves, economic harm can also be caused by expectation of likely future conflicts and doubt about how they could be resolved or how high growth could be resumed in this environment. This uncertainty could, for example, discourage investment and entrepreneurship and accelerate a brain drain. Thus, work on the consequences, causes, and potential curative and preventive remedies for violent conflict and improvement of conditions that may lead to such conflict has become an important part of the field of economic development. As we see in this figure, the number and intensity of violent conflicts grew for nearly half a century following the end of World War II, but reached a peak by the early 1990s. Since then, such conflicts have decreased substantially. This figure also summarizes violent conflicts incidents over time, adjusted for magnitude, but the intensity and consequences of societal warfare, particularly ethnic war, remain at unacceptable high levels, comparable to the 1960s. In a newer figure, we can see that on the whole, the global level of armed conflicts in 2020 was similar to 2019, showing approximately the same number of conflicts, wars, and casualties. In figure number 1, we illustrate conflicts trend from 1989 to 2020. While the number of conflicts has risen over this time period, the number of casualties is slightly down. The data used in this policy brief were collected by the UPP-SALA Conflict Data Program or UCDP, which records and classifies armed conflicts around the world to the period 1945 to 2020. The UCDP distinguishes between wars and minor conflicts. Wars are defined by battle-related deaths or BRD in excess of 1,000 per year, while minor conflicts accounts for BRD between 25 and 1,000 annually. Here are some brief points of the trends in armed conflicts in 2020. There were 56 active conflicts recorded during the year. The number of fatalities reported in 2020 dropped to under 50,000 for the first time since 2012. Afghanistan remains the deadliest conflict with about 40% of all casualties recorded in 2020. There were 8 wars active in 2020, up from 7 in 2019 and 6 in 2018. IS or Islamic State was involved in 16 conflicts in 2020. These conflicts accounts for 13% of all casualties. The consequences of armed conflict. Violent conflict harms health in ways both obvious and unexpected. People not involved in violence can be affected almost immediately as parents lose their livelihood or become refugees and children are forced to work. Recovery from the consequences can take many years. Conflict can cause children to miss out on schooling in their most formative years, harming their well-being over a lifetime. And it can take years to mend a social torn fabric that might help cushion the fall. Health. The immediate effect of war is the most visible. At first, more men died than women, primarily as a result of the fighting itself. Over time, more women die, as they suffer the lingering consequences much more. Maternal mortality can be shockingly high, an estimate 3% in conflict areas such as the Democratic Republic of Congo. Scholars have found that the long-term effects of conflicts fall most heavily on women, diminishing their access to health, social welfare services, and education. Rape has become a weapon of terror. Many victims die in rape attacks, and many more suffer long-term health consequences, including AIDS and chronic depression. As Nina Birkeland summarizes, in conflicts with an ethnic dimensions, systematic rape has commonly been used to destabilize population and destroy community and family bonds. Refugee children and women are at particular risk for rape and sexual exploitation. Destruction of wealth. Violent conflict destroys capital, and some of what is not destroyed is diverted to destructive activities. Additional wealth is often shipped abroad. One study found that on average, a tenth of a country's wealth is transferred abroad between the beginning and the end of a conflict, largely as capital fight, as better off residents seek to protect their wealth. In some countries, fighting is very localized, but one study found an average annual growth of negative 3.3% in countries in conflict as a whole. By the end of by the end of the typical civil war, incomes are around 15% lower than they would otherwise have been, implying that about 30% more people are living in absolute poverty. Not surprisingly, conflict causes increases in unemployment. No wonder civil war has been called development in reverse. Worsening hunger and poverty. It is not surprising that in many conflict countries, food production drops. One survey found this had happened in 13 out of 18 conflict countries studied. The International Food Policy Research Institute found that more than 20% of the population usually lacks access to adequate food in conflict and post-conflict countries. Hunger is also a weapon of war. Fighters have cut off food supplies and attempted to starve opposing populations into submission. They also steal food aid. Poverty increases through declines in opportunities to earn income, but also through the direct outcomes of fighting. Killing or driving off farm animals is a weapon of war. Other animals may starve. In the aftermath of conflict, affected areas may be slow to recover for reasons ranging from lack of working capital to poisoned resources and the dangers of landmine. The rights of displaced widows and children in particular are often given no regard by the authorities. Institutions to resolve property disputes may be dysfunctional or never be established. These are some of the factors extending the consequences of conflicts well after the end of fighting. Loss of education. In 8 countries in conflict for which data were available, the IMF found that during the conflict, education spending fell at a rate of negative 4.3% per person per year. Moreover, sometimes children cannot risk the walk to school because of the danger of violence, and both government soldiers and rebels have destroyed schools that symbolize the hope of a village. Instead of getting an education, many children work long hours to survive, and under conditions of lawlessness and impunity, trafficking and kidnapping into sex slavery, child soldiering, and other abhorrent conditions have been documented. A torn social fabric. Violent conflict, or its imminent threat, creates refugees. One estimate is an additional 64 refugees per 1,000 people on average from a civil war, 45 per 1,000 from coups, and 30 per 1,000 from guerrilla warfare. According to the United Nations, by the end of 2008, there were about 26 million internally displaced persons, or IDPs, due to conflict, generalized violence, or human rights violations. As concluded in the 2010 Millennium Development Goals Report, armed conflicts remains a major threat to human society, and to hard-won MDG gains, large population and refugees remain in camps with limited opportunities to improve their lives. The causes of armed conflicts and risk factors for conflict. Conflict is more common in countries with lower incomes, slow growth, medium to large populations, significant oil production, and poor institutions. So it is not just economic and not just cultural. The problem seems to be worse when there are high inequalities across groups that people identify with. Horizontal inequalities. Francis Stewart proposes that the presence of major horizontal inequalities, or HIs, or inequalities among culturally defined groups, significantly raise the risk of conflict. She argues that when cultural differences coincide with economic and political differences between groups, this can cause deep resentment that may lead to violent struggles. In her framework, it is a combination of cultural differences and political and economic inequalities running along cultural lines that, in part at least, explains contemporary violent conflict. She concludes these findings have important implications for development policy. They suggest that policies to correct economic, social, and political HIs should be prioritized in multi-ethnic societies as part of general development policies, especially in post-conflict environments. Natural resources for basic needs. Basic needs resource scarcity, especially shortage of food, fertile land, and water, may contribute to conflict or ongoing risk of conflict. Colin Kahl argues that scarcity can increase the risk of violent conflict, and cites quantitative studies that suggest that population size and density are significant conflict risk factors. Countries that are highly dependent on natural resources, as well as those experiencing high rates of deforestation and soil degradation or low per capita availability of arable land and fresh water, have higher risk of conflict. Struggle to control exportable natural resources. The presence of high-value exportable resources such as diamonds, oil, and hardwood without accepted or enforceable rules for how their benefits will be distributed also appears to be an underlying factor in violent conflict. Paul Collier argues that what he terms the conflict trap shows how certain economic conditions make a country prone to civil war, and how once conflict has started, the cycle of violence becomes a trap from which it is difficult to escape. He finds that countries are prone to civil war when faced with low income, slow growth, and dependence on primary commodity exports. The resolution and prevention of armed conflicts. Importance of institutions. Legal rules and informal norms define and reinforce the ways that the interests of different groups, even when strongly opposing, can be resolved, at least to the point where development can proceed. Good institutions provide the foundation of basic securities and rights. To successfully prevent, or at least strongly mitigate risk of armed conflicts that is likely to retard and set back progress. A good institution in this context facilitates conflict resolution, avoiding violence, and doing so in a way that allows capabilities to grow. Without improvements in underlying institutions, purely political agreements come with a danger of relapse or can fail to create conditions for balanced economic development. Moreover, military expenditures are possibly a cause of conflict, not merely an effect of conflict. The share of low and middle income countries' military expenditures in the world spending has been rising. For example, from 14% in 1920 to 24% in 2009. Global actors in post-conflict development engagement by global, regional, national, and community level actors is critical. National security, again a foundational institution, cannot be taken for granted when violence crosses borders and remnant violent and criminal forces are still active in cross-border enclaves. New international rules and agreements are helping to reduce the problem of incentives for conflict by creating controls on exports and imports of high-value resources. Moreover, business, government, and civil societies are partnering for foster international voluntary agreements to reduce financial incentives for war or to ensure that the resources do not fund conflict. In addition, some 32 countries have agreed to voluntarily implement the Extractive Industries Transparent Initiative or EITI, under which firms publish what they pay governments for resource extractions. The government publishes what it earns, and a multi-stakeholder group and outside auditors reconcile these figures to ensure that the money from resource goes to the public that owns them. Regional actors, an Africa-wide approach. Post-conflict reconstruction is also a problem for multinational regional cooperation. The African Union has played an increasing role in addressing violent conflicts and its aftermath, particularly through peacekeeping operations. Once a peace agreement is signed and a functioning transition or permanent government in place, support for post-conflict economic development becomes central. Here, the African Development Bank, or AFDB, plays an active role. Its fragile state unit positions fragile states it works with along a continuum spanning two stages. In stage 1, governments have to show a commitment to consolidate peace and security and have unmet social economic needs. In stage 2, governments must demonstrate that they are improving macroeconomic conditions and pursuing sound debt policy, have sound financial management policy, and exhibit transparency of public accounts. National actors. The state must be strong enough to reliably protect its citizens from violence and to carry out other important roles that only government can play. State fragility is a big part of the problem, but there must also be an effective checks and balances. A harsh regime that suppresses violence and rebellion, but keeps resources and power in the hands of a small elite is likely to produce only a temporary solution to preventing violence. Even if a state monopoly on violence suppresses over conflict, the result may reinforce inequalities. Multilateral outside assistance may be needed to establish basic peace and security. Then it is crucial to ensure broad opportunities and to make the gains from cooperation more apparent. Corruption is often part of the struggle for resources, particularly exportable natural resources. Addressing corruption may help prevent conflict before it breaks out, and corruption is generally viewed as particularly destabilizing in post-conflict situations. One problem is that post-conflict environment presents officials with low-risk opportunities for corrupt activity. This is further magnified because post-conflict countries often attract or justify relatively high level of aids. Trust among former warring parties or parties at risk must be rebuilt. Conflict can be understood as a problem of multiple equilibria, with failure to coordinate, which may depend on social norms about conflict and cooperation. Bad equilibria may result from a set of expectations that conflicts cannot or will not be peacefully resolved. Focus on education. UNESCO's Education for All, or EFA, points to the mutually reinforcing relationship between low education and violent conflicts. The fact that conflicts harms education by destroying infrastructure, killing students and teachers, and so on is obvious. EFA notes that education also affects conflicts, as conflict may originate in an ideology that may be widely disseminated through education. The EFA framework thus calls for conflict-sensitive education and policy initiatives termed Reconstruction Education. Local, community-driven economic development. Economic participation at the local level is very important, as some research has found that community-driven development, or CDD, can play an important role. Patrick Baron notes that effective CDD projects can distribute resources quickly and to remote rural areas. In developing decision-making, they can help ensure that resources distribution is fair and popularly accepted. The study of community development and other strategies for conflict prevention and post-conflict recovery is still at an early stage, but new results are now being reported regularly. An assessment by Ghazala Mansouri and Vijayendra Rao also concluded that CDD is more effective when implemented in a context-specific manner, with a long time horizon, and with a careful and well-designed monitoring and evaluation systems. A recent experimental study in Sierra Leone found CDD led to more market activity and to improvements in local public goods, such as functioning primary schools and community grain drying floors, though not in women's decision-making influence or the raising of local revenue for community purposes. This is an important and growing field in economic development. The emphasis on fragile and conflict states in development assistance has never been stronger. Addressing state fragility is expected to be a centerpiece of the new Sustainable Development Goals.